how that landmark decision basically made a big difference on how we interpret right to privacy under the 14th Amendment. So let's just kind of, the book I don't think goes into a lot of detail about Roe v. Wade, but let's take a look at the case for just a minute. The facts of the case are these. Roe, a Texas resident, sought to terminate her pregnancy by abortion. Texas law prohibited abortions except to save a pregnant woman's life. After granting certiorari, we're going to talk about what a certiorari is. Basically, a certiorari, just to let you know what the term means, is basically when you want your case heard in front of the Supreme Court, you have to submit what is called a writ of certiorari. And that's basically asking the court's permission for it to hear your case. I know it sounds kind of funny, but we're going to talk about the reason the writs are so important a little later. The court heard arguments twice. The first time, Roe's attorney, Sarah Weddington, could not locate the constitutional hook of her argument for Justice Potter Stewart. Her opponent, Jay Floyd, misfired from the start. Weddington sharpened her constitutional argument in the second round. Her opponent, Robert Flowers, came under strong questioning from Justices Potter Stewart, Thurgood Marshall. The question was this: does the Constitution embrace a woman's right to terminate her pregnancy by abortion? Does the Constitution embrace? The conclusion was this: 7 votes for, 2 against. So it was a pretty substantial majority that said, yes, the Constitution does embrace a woman's right for an abortion. Here's the reasoning. The court held that a woman's right to an abortion fell within the right to privacy, protected by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The decision gave a woman total autonomy over the pregnancy during the first trimester and defined different levels of state interest for the second and third trimesters. As a result, the laws of 46 states were affected by the court's ruling. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution says, with regard to privacy, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. There's something in there that says you're entitled to your privacy and the decisions you make for yourself are yours. Life, liberty, property. Liberty being freedom. Your freedom. Your freedom to choose. Do you accept the court's argument that the case was rightfully decided where the Constitution would embrace the woman's right to an abortion using the 14th Amendment? The 14th Amendment, from that point forward, early 1970s and thereafterward, will become very, very important with regard to privacy issues. Well, why didn't the court use the 9th Amendment? The 9th Amendment, after all, says simply this: the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. It doesn't say anything about abortion specifically in the Constitution. So if it doesn't say anything about abortion in the Constitution, then isn't that a right? Would it arguably be a right that's retained by the people? Why wouldn't the 9th Amendment trump the 14th Amendment in the court's decision? That's been a debate. The Ninth Amendment really wasn't given much respect or credit or whatever during that period of time. So what good is it? What do you think? Do you think the court made the right decision? Or was a decision made along ideological grounds based on the makeup of the court at that time? The court was arguably a very liberal court. What do you think?
The judges are going to make a huge difference.
The justices will make a huge difference, and that's why it's so critical to understand the ideological framework of justices as they're being appointed to the bench. We need to know what we're getting because we're going to be living with them probably for 30 or 40 years.
I wouldn't say I disagree with their decision.
Do you have anything else to base that on?
Probably ideological beliefs.
Okay, that's reasonable. Who would take exception to that decision? In other words, women have the right to choose whether or not have an abortion. You know, today, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but we do, we have this thing called a wedge issue. There's not too many people in the middle on a wedge issue. You're either on one side or the other. You have right to life, pro-life, or you have free to choose. And we're always talking, it seems like, about women's right to choose an abortion. You're either on one side of this issue or the other. There are some people that try to straddle the fence. Well, I believe in the right, what did someone say? Pro-life, that are pro-life, except for these conditions. The woman's life is at stake, the woman has been raped, or incest has been committed. So those are the three reasons a lot of people will give for why they may go from this out here to more, well, three conditions, or one of those three conditions exists. So they're not exactly out here on the polarized distance on the plane. Free to choose may have to do with where the woman is in her pregnancy, whether or not a woman should be able to choose or not. At what point does an unborn child become a human being? That's where you'll hear a lot of faith-based organizations talk about in their argument for or against abortion. So it's not an easy issue. It's not a pleasant issue to talk about. Some people think it should never become a political issue in the first place.
That's where I am.
Pardon me?
That's where I am.
Yeah. Well, that's good. But we're not going to solve this issue today. But does the woman have that much power with regard to her privacy in choosing an abortion? That's really the question. Is it really only the woman's decision to make with regard to privacy? Or are there other factors that come into play?
The father is around.
The father might have a little bit of a stake in the matter, potentially. Except, in cases of one of those three exceptions, perhaps, I don't think the father would have much of a leg to stand on. And that's just me saying that. But who advocates for the unborn child? So, yes?
So why does the government need to be involved in this issue?
Because it happens. It occurs in our society, and it occurs in our in our hospitals. And so women go in and they have this procedure done, and there needs to be some kind of a value or whatever placed on that whole event. And so, is it acceptable with our set of norms and principles that we have as a people? Is that behavior that we want to? And I hope I'm answering your question. That's really what it centers around. Do we, as a part of who we are as a people, accept that abortions are okay?
States have something, state laws have something.
Well, that's exactly right. Some states are more strict on abortions, and we're not, but they still have to be in compliance with pretty much the decision that was handed down, because that establishes precedents for what occurs thereafter. one of the very first questions, and we'll talk about this later when we get to the Supreme Court, one of the very first questions the Senate Judiciary Committee will ask a person that's been nominated to the Supreme Court is this question: would you vote to overturn Roe v. Wade? Basically, it's a litmus test. They want to make sure that if a conservative is nominated by a president to serve on the bench, they want to make darn sure. They asked John Roberts that, they asked Samuel Alito that, they asked Clarence Thomas that, they asked anybody that was appointed as a conservative to the bench over the last 20 years whether they would vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. Of course, the only intelligible answer to that question is it's not just up to me as one of 9 justices. And I can't reach out and grab a case and bring it into the court for the purposes of overturning precedents. So, and that's the right answer. It's called stare decisis. If something has already been established by the court will only have the opportunity to overturn a previous ruling if a similar case is brought before it again. And not only one justice is capable, and not just one justice is capable of making that happen. It takes 4 of them. 4 of them to accept a writ of certiorari to bring a case before the Supreme Court. So that's kind of a checks and balance, if you will, within the Supreme Court structure. It's a very secretive process, by the way.
It takes 5 to overturn
It takes 5 to, it takes a majority of 5 out of 9 to overturn a decision, previous decision. So it's not a very easy process to overturn something that's in precedence or established via stare decisis. Any questions on that? You may want to think about where you stand on that. That may be an area of public policy that may be of interest to you, where you want to maybe be an advocate for or against this viewpoint. Some of us think that life begins at conception. That's pretty extreme over that side, isn't it? Some believe that abortion is a contraceptive, and what's wrong with it? There was a poll taken about 10 years ago, and I forgot what the statistic, the scientific makeup of the survey was. It's not really important for the illustrations here, but the results of the survey basically said that 28% of the women that were surveyed say they use abortion as a contraceptive, strictly as a contraceptive. So let's go back to values, principles, who we are as a people with regard to how we maybe look at these issues. Again, my opinion doesn't count, does it? It really doesn't. In something like this, because we're not going to, like I said, we're not going to settle this issue today. There's something you may want to be concerned about for yourself and how you feel about this issue. Maybe you want to join an interest group to get involved in some of these issues that we bring up that are very controversial. Okay, any other questions? We're done with chapter 4, moving right into chapter 5. We'll be getting into chapter 6 on Friday. Hope you're reading ahead. Before I forget about it, I did post the assignment yesterday at 5 o'clock. There are 25 questions worth 1 point each. They will go into Blackboard as up to 25 points. That's basically my way of checking to make sure you did all the questions, or answered all the questions. I will go in and I will re-level those back down to 5 points. So I won't go back on what we agreed to at the beginning of the semester as far as where the collective of 50 points comes from. You've got until, I think, 9 o'clock next Monday night to complete this assignment. So it's out there for quite a while. You can go in multiple times and get it back into the quiz. I set the policy for that. I also set the policy that will give you immediate feedback on your answer, so you'll know exactly what's going on. You may want to have the book with you when you're taking the quiz or whatever. And I was very selective on the questions as far as being able to hopefully tie it back to the text or to the lecture. These PowerPoints are on Blackboard. I did edit them a little bit last night, but I included my lecture notes in the PowerPoint. So my lecture notes really aren't fair game for posting PowerPoints. So you may want to take marginal notes on things that I've added. Does that make sense? Any questions at all about what I just said? Civil rights. We talked about civil liberties. When we talk about civil liberties, we're talking about what? In chapter 4, primarily, principally. What are we talking about when we're talking about civil liberties? How would you best describe what a civil liberty is? Before we get into the right discussion of civil rights, what are civil liberties? Bill of Rights. What's another word? The liberty? Freedom. So your freedoms. Your freedom. When we think of freedom, we think of our Bill of Rights. We think of things that are afforded to us under the Constitution. Our expectation, our reasonable expectation of what we're allowed to do. With the due process, with reasonable privacy, right to privacy, with not being exposed to cruel and unusual punishment, to be able to be tried with a group of our peers, the right to defense counsel, be protected from the government just coming in and just taking anything they want from us. It's called the takings provision, which is the last element under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. So we have all these civil liberties that we enjoy, and if they're not expressed necessarily, if we have not otherwise delegated certain powers to the government that would relieve us of some of our civil liberties, then everything that's not mentioned is reserved for us. Right? Does that make sense? That's kind of a hard concept to put your arms around. Yes?
The law of rights that says that a spouse doesn't have to testify against another spouse.
Right.
Where is that located?
Fifth Amendment.
It is the Fifth, okay.
Why is that? Why shouldn't a spouse have to testify against the spouse? Why do you think that is? I mean, that's not the same human being. Their rights are potentially alienable.
Conflict of interest.
Conflict of interest in what way?
Some people are just so much more.
Kind of attorney-client privilege, right?
So
Your
much
spouse
more
is.
to that person even than
Yeah, your spouse is going to know a lot about you, and just because of the relationship under law. By the way, the relationship is under law.
And that's supposed to be your other half. That
Right.
might be testifying against yourself.
Yeah.
Is it kind of like double jeopardy?
No, double jeopardy is different. Double jeopardy means that you've already been convicted for a crime, and you can't be convicted for the same crime again.
Okay.
It's like the Naomi Judd, or actually Judd movie with Tommy Lee Jones.
Right.
She already went to prison and served punishment for killing her husband, and the next time there's going to be a freebie because she's already been convicted of doing that. And so when she shot him down in New Orleans after the fact, and that was a freebie. He should have known that. So, does that answer the question as far as spouse? I mean, I would hate to break, my wife and I've been, we've been married over 37 years. Boy, that sounds like a long time. So we've been married 37 years. There's a lot of things she knows about me. Okay. All right. The meaning of equality under law, inherent characteristics. We're going to talk about strict scrutiny in just a minute. Heightened scrutiny and ordinary scrutiny. Those are the three tests that the courts will use to determine if the government was proper in differentiating between groups of people. In other words, they did do it to protect the safety, well-being of a community based on differentiating among groups. In other words, discriminating among groups. That's when the government discriminates. Did they have a good basis for discrimination? Because they wanted to keep everybody safe and everything else. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Suspect classification, race, religion, national origin, and sex. Well, let's look at race. Big issue came up several years ago, and it still does, racial profiling. What do you think about racial profiling? I mean, without the obvious, I mean, is it something that we should always have our antenna up? If somebody is in a upper class neighborhood and they happen to be of color, should law enforcement be on extra alert just because there's a African American or a Hispanic person or Indian person in the neighborhood? Let's pull them over and see what they want. They're not supposed to be here. This is an upper class white neighborhood, after all. How dare they be here? That happens, doesn't it? Is it reasonable? Pardon me?
Not based on what I know.
Well, yeah, not the reasonable, and we have a rational actor model, right? The book talks about what's rational, what makes sense.
That makes sense to me. Because I know lots of people of different races that may go through that part of county because they're on the way to something, and I know them very well, and they wouldn't do anything wrong. Yet they might get pulled over just because they're different race.
Now, my sister lives in kind of an upscale neighborhood of Blue Springs, and 3 doors down is the former running back for the Kansas City Chiefs, Kimball Anders. And he just lives 3 doors down from my sister. And it's no big deal to see Kimball Anders driving through the neighborhood. Wave at him, just all that kind of stuff. So it's no big deal. Neil Smith, former running back for the Chiefs, or not a running back, what was he, defensive? He was a linebacker. Linebacker, yeah. He bought a house right just about 4 blocks from where I used to live in Kansas City. So there are a lot of Chiefs and Royals, few Oakland Raiders, few Denver Broncos that live out in Blue Springs. You just don't think anything about it. What about everywhere else? Yeah.
What about that Arizona bill?
What about the Arizona bill? What about that?
Basically,
What about that?
gives the law enforcement the ability to racial profile.
And why do you think that that's a bad thing, given the geographical location of Arizona? I'm arguing with you.
Well, I'm just saying, not everybody's an illegal immigrant.
Right.
Just because they fit the profile doesn't mean you gotta pull them over at any place.
My wife and I we lived in New Mexico for 5 years. We lived in Arizona for a year, down in Tucson, and my wife is a blonde. And we were driving from Las Cruces up to Albuquerque, and we got pulled over at a border guard checkpoint up at Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, up by Ellison Butte Lake. And so we get pulled over. I'm an Army officer stationed out at White Sands Missile Range, and the Border Patrol demanded that my wife say something. Well, my wife's pretty quiet, you know, not so much anymore, but certainly back then she was pretty quiet. But so they wanted to hear her say something to determine whether she was Mexican or not. Well, if you look at my wife, I guess there are blonde Mexicans down in Mexico City or something. But, pardon me?
You'd be surprised.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I know. I realize that.
But that, they can be pretty ruthless. I've had the experiences with Border Patrol.
Well, describe that for us, if you don't mind.
Oh, no. Well, I went down to Mexico when I was like 10 or 11, and I went with a couple of my cousins and all them. We drove a truck down there, and once we get right down to the border,
Was it a white panel truck?
there was
With no markings?
blue truck. But we had all our luggage, and we had some trash bags full of gifts we were going to give to my abuelita or my grandma. And when we got there, they searched the truck, they threw the knife in the trash bag, they searched it, threw it all out, and, oh, you're good. I mean, we had to clean it all up, but, I mean, it took, like 2 hours just to get through.
Wow.
All because we were all Mexican. And make sure-
Is that what they told you?
Well.
That's what
it
you
seemed like it.
presumed?
Yeah, because everybody else was just going like this. So we would just stop.
Has anybody, because of maybe who you are from a social class standpoint, or from an education standpoint, or from an age standpoint, or from a religious standpoint, ever observed any other type of similar act? Yeah.
I lived in San Diego. I was a Navy wife, and we would go down to Mexico, Tijuana, even further down south. But every time we came back, I don't know if it was because of our age or my ex-husband looked, so he was in the Navy, we got pulled into secondary every single time. No matter if we were driving a little red Hyundai or a green Mustang, or every time we got pulled into secondary, and they ripped our car apart every time.
Yeah, that would get a little old. I'm kind of at that point now. You know, when you're over 40 years old, you're supposed to be in a protected group now because of age discrimination. So you're not supposed to be discriminated on based on your age. And so if you're 40 or over, you're supposed to be in that protected class or that protected group. Well, I have to tell you, I'm 55, and all of a sudden, I don't know why, maybe I feel like that's because I'm always around young people here at the university, but for some reason you feel like you're getting a little older all of a sudden, and people are starting to take note. Well, you're old. You're old. But you know, personally, I don't feel that. I feel like I'm still 30, 35, 40 years old. Still try to do things like that. Now, I obviously can't because I weigh about 80 pounds more than I did when I retired in 1999. So I can't go out and run 7 miles every day like I normally can, or used to be able to. But I'm at that point now where I can kind of almost feel I'm conscientious about age because I think people are looking at me differently because I'm getting older. What do you think about that? I don't want to get old. Well,
It's better than the alternative.
yeah, that's right. So race, religion, we think about religion, we think about Ground Zero. They're wanting to put a mosque. Some Muslims were wanting to put a mosque at Ground Zero or near Ground Zero. We took an exception to that. A lot of us did, or some people did in New York City, saying, how dare the Muslims want to put a mosque at Ground Zero? After all, the terrorists